What is going on, gunfighters? Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. I am your host, Michael Melito, first and foremost a Christian. Saddle up for another episode of Gunfighter Life. Today, we're going to be talking about generations of cartridges. Now, if you're the kind of ballistics nerd that a lot of us are, like if you can tell me the difference in gain of velocity between the 280 and the 280 Ackley improved, and you know offhand the difference in sectional density between 150 grain 7mm bullet and 150 grain 30 caliber bullet, you may not get a lot out of this episode. But I gotta remember, not everybody's been doing this for decades. People get into shooting all the time, and not everybody's into history, because history plays a big part in what we're going to talk about today, the generations of cartridges. I really like history, and I really like guns, and to me they go hand in hand, but maybe not everybody's into what guns did they use in the Napoleonic era versus the Civil War versus the Russo-Japanese War, versus the Mexican-American War, and how much they changed in that time period, and then what happened going into World War I, and when smokeless powder was invented. Not everybody knows or cares about that stuff, but I think today's episode is going to be important, even if you don't care about history, if you care about choosing the right cartridge to fit your needs. Not just the next marketing hype, oh, I need this because it's got these letters after it, or it's got a super high BC. Does that even apply to you? Do you even care about ballistics coefficient? We're going to get into that and kind of explaining that and what you need. You may decide lower tech is better for you for whatever reason. So I've been considering where to start on this episode. I could go all the way back to once upon a time in China, gunpowder was invented. I'm not going to go back that far. Let's go back to muzzle loaders. Muzzle loaders right before metallic cartridges became a thing. A lot of Americans are probably familiar with the American Civil War. This was kind of like, there were metallic cartridges, but for the most part, it was fought with muzzle loaders. You have basically a metal tube with a stock in its most basic form. You dump black powder down the barrel. You have a lead ball. Yes, there were Minet balls and things like that, but for simplicity, a lead ball with some kind of sealant, a patch, a cloth patch. You shove that down to be on top of the powder and keep it all in one tight, neat little package. This time we had mercury fulminate or a similar kind of priming compound. What you really have to know is when you hit priming compound with a certain amount of force very suddenly, it ignites and makes a spark. That spark ignites the powder. This in that era was called a percussion cap. You would put that on the outside of the firearm on what's called a nipple, and you'd have a hammer that you cocked back with a spring. This may sound familiar to you. A lot of firearms even today have hammers, and you would drop that hammer, it would hit that percussion cap, igniting the powder, and the ball would go out the barrel. I know, super basic, but it's kind of a laborious process. I have done quite a bit of muzzleloader. I have hunted with muzzleloader. I have competed in muzzleloader. It's a laborious process. It's not known for speed. Look at the rounds of minute that a really good, well-trained soldier can put down range versus what we can today, because there's a lot of steps in that. Somebody had the bright idea of, what if we could contain all this? The very first ones were paper cartridges. I'm not going to call that a generation. And then somebody thought, what if we got a metallic cartridge that didn't have to worry about getting wet so much or humidity so much or didn't bend or break so much? What if you put it in a metallic cartridge, something like copper or brass? And what if we took that priming compound, I know there were things before this like pinfire, but keep it basic. What if we took that percussion cap and shoved it in the back of that metallic cartridge? That same priming compound, rimfire, and then eventually center fire, what we're familiar with today most of the time. Look at that, where it looks an awful lot like a percussion cap stuck in the back of that metallic cartridge. You move the powder into a metallic casing, if you will, with the primer on the casing, either on the rim or in the center. You put the bullet on the top. I'm going to call this your first generation metallic cartridge. Gen 1. Really early. Usually just a straight wall. Whatever the bullet diameter was, It would put the same similar diameter case behind it, fill it with black powder with some kind of priming compound. For these early cartridges, I'm talking about probably the most common one you're still familiar with today in this first generation, 4570. So you might be familiar with like 44 Henry, 4590, 45110, 5070. These are all pretty crudely shaped bullets, not very aerodynamic, shoved onto a brass case about their same diameter. I believe all the early ones had a rim, and a big reason for the rim, it aided with extraction, and also metallurgy and tolerances aren't as exact back then as they are today. So it's an easy way to headspace. You don't have to know what headspacing is, but you'll notice that many early cartridges, in fact all of them I believe, have a rim. It was an easy node to measure cartridges off of and headspace off of. It was also an easy thing to pull the cartridge out with, a rim. Also keep in mind that by and large, and maybe entirely, all these projectiles are just straight lead, just cast lead. You would have a bullet mold like I used when I was a kid to cast bullets. You would pour hot molten lead in there and it would form in the shape of your bullet. Lead was what we used for centuries, and it continued to be used in these early forms like the 4570. For lower velocity black powder, it's fine. It will lead a little bit in your bore, but not nearly as much as higher velocity cartridges. So lead was okay. And also, caveat here, guys, I'm going to say that these are gross generalities. I'm not the biggest nerd when it comes to this stuff. Maybe somebody had a projected bullet back then, but by and large, all the cartridges I'm familiar with in this era are just straight lead bullets in a brass cartridge case with a primer. So that's Gen 1. Again, 4570 is still pretty common. The other really common one in this, surprisingly, the 22 long rifle. If you look at it, it's pretty much everything I described in a baby version. A little 22 caliber head, you got a straight brass case. In this case, the priming compound is on the rim. It's a rim fire. But that's pretty much it. It was originally loaded with black powder. It carried over like the 4570. The initial offerings were in black powder. Very much both of these are still common and still a Gen 1 cartridge. Then in the 1880s, the French. Yes, the French. Not only did they give us French fries, which I don't know if they actually are French, but they did give us smokeless powder. In the 1880s, smokeless powder became a thing, and it gave much higher velocities and much better performance, and it was far less dirty. If you've ever shot black powder muzzle loaders, you will know how filthy and disgusting and corrosive that residue is. Smokeless powder burns much cleaner. That's why it's called smokeless powder. You shot a black powder muzzleloader, there's giant clouds of smoke. Go look at a picture of like reenactors all shoot black powder in a line and how big a cloud that makes. Also, in addition to those things, black powder takes up a lot more volume. So that's why you see most of the military cartridges of the era 50 caliber, 45 caliber. Because with that straight wall, you need a big case to give that much power. If you'd have had, let's say, a 30 caliber back in the mid-1800s, it would have had to been so long as to be ridiculous to put, let's say, wanted a 4570, that 70 grains of black powder, that's what that stands for. If you wanted that 70 grains in a 30 caliber, think of how long that cylinder would have to be. I think that's a big reason why you don't see those. Until the French in the 1880s invent the smokeless powder cartridge. And they put it in an 8mm, which is a little bit bigger than our 30 caliber today. Generally don't use a lot of 8mm rifle cartridges here in America, but they're quite common at other places in the world still. 8mm Mauser you might be familiar with. The Germans used it in World War II. The 8mm Lebel is pretty obscure now, but it was revolutionary at the time, considering what everybody else had, which was these big bore black powder cartridges, where they invented this smokeless powder. And it was giving very impressive results, both in velocity, which is important. Remember, force equals mass times velocity squared. The squared part is important, so if you up the velocity, you can greatly increase the power of a round. It gave impressive velocity, it burned much cleaner, and you didn't need nearly as much room. The limiting factor there was the pressure. Powder is a lot lower pressure, so you could make it out of weaker steels and the technology of the day. Generated much higher pressures, or could generate much higher pressures with the smokeless powder. A lot less volume. They determined that that smaller diameter bullet was a good And I'm going to call this the Gen 2 cartridges. And initial loadings of the 8mm Labelle, which is pretty obscure, but also the initial loadings of the 303 British, I believe, was very much like this. It was smokeless powder. The bullet was small. You generally had a neck on the cartridge. That's part of the Gen 2. So the cartridge, metallic cartridge case, is bigger than the bullet, so it's got a neck in it. If you look at most modern rifle cartridges, unless it's for some restrictive state where you have to have a straight wall, it's got a neck. That's so you can have high powder capacity and a small bullet. So the 8 Labelle, the 303 British, the initial loadings, the 3003 American, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, the 7.62 by 54 Russian. There's probably a lot more, but those are pretty common ones. And they still had a pretty big bullet. I don't know if the initial loadings were lead. Pretty early on, they figured out if you're driving bullets at this velocity, they put a lot of lead in barrels. A certain threshold, and I forget what it is, that you can drive lead, and it's not that bad. If you drive it faster, you get a lot of lead fouling. That lead starts to melt off and come apart and stick into the barrel, which I shouldn't have to explain why that's bad. Put a metal jacket on these bullets. Oh, and I should mention a really popular one that's in this genre, the 30-30 Winchester. Now, these had a much more streamlined bullet than, say, a 45-70, but they still had a rounded front end. Some of them continue to have that rounded front end, like the 30-30, because they're stacked in tubular magazines, which were popular at the time. Winchester 1873, the Winchester 1894, the Winchester Model 94 we're all familiar with. The tube magazines were popular at the time, because at the time it didn't make any difference, but if you look at the back of a primer, you can't really stack that safely with a pointy bullet. Many of these early cartridges didn't have pointy bullets, but pretty soon they realized with these smaller diameter bullets, if we make them pointy, they fly better. That seems pretty rudimentary, but you got to remember at the time, they were lobbing cannonballs. So, to make them more streamlined, they made pointy bullets. So remember I talked about the 3003. Quickly became from 1903 to 1906 the 3006. Gave it a pointy bullet. There were some other minor, I think, neck shape changes, but basically they put a pointy bullet on it. I believe, if memory serves correct, and you might want to check this, you might want to check all this stuff by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is established. But they went from a 220 grain round nose bullet to 150 grain pointed Spitzer bullet. This is when Spitzer bullets became a thing, and Spitzer basically just means pointed. I don't have to remember what that means, but a pointy bullet. The 8mm Labelle, which we talked about, went this route. The 303 British quickly went this route. The 7.62 by 54 Russian went this route. Those rounds are still around. They have pointy bullets now, and they have copper jackets. For the reasons stated, they're better aerodynamically, and they don't lead the barrel. I'm going to call this a Gen 3. So, popular Gen 2s that are still available, the 30-30. Generally, to talk about some of the lever revolution with a soft tip, you can't have a pointy bullet on these because they stack in a tubular magazine. The 30-30 is a real common Gen 2 cartridge. And then the Gen 3, and this is what we had up until fairly recently. This took us from the early 1900s. We talked about the 30-06, that's an easy way to remember it. The early turn of the century, all the way up until very, very recently. So what characterizes these, and this is going to be the bulk of your cartridges that we're going to talk about that are common today. A center fire, metallic brass alloy of some kind case that's necked. The cartridge, the powder is a lot larger diameter than the bullet, with a jacket around the bullet, with a fairly pointy bullet profile. Pointy bullet profile, the object's ability to fly through, in almost every case, air. Ballistics coefficient. Just remember ballistics coefficient, it's the projectile's ability or efficiency at slicing through the air to reach the target. So if you look at the BCF, something like a 45-70 bullet versus a 30-06 150 grain bullet, it's a big advance. So if you look at the velocity of a 30-06 versus a 45-70, it's a giant advance. It's a giant leap forward. But your 30-06, and when they wanted to make that cartridge more efficient, the 308 Winchester. These are all these Gen 3 cartridges. All they're, what a lot of times started out as Wildcats and now are mainstream. The 243, 308 necked down to a 6mm or 243 caliber. A 270, a 30-06 necked down with a smaller bullet to .277 caliber. A 35 Whelen, a 30-06 necked up to .35 caliber. You get the idea. Almost all the cartridges we're familiar with today are these Gen 3 cartridges. Getting into the Magnums, the 375 H&H, they made a big beefy case bigger than most common rounds. The big champagne bottles of the day were called Magnums. They said, why don't we call this a Magnum? Kind of, if you look at a cartridge case, kind of looks like a big champagne bottle, or a little champagne bottle, that is. They called it the 375 H&H Magnum. And you get a bunch of Magnums off of that, and a lot of Magnums. They're still in this Gen 3, I would call them. I wouldn't call that a new generation. They put a belt on it that throws some more powder in it. But it's still basically the same. Your 7 mag, your 300 Win mag. Again, most of your popular cartridges today, I'm going to call those Gen 3. Now, bullet technology has come a long way from most of these early rounds were just full metal jackets or maybe a soft nose lead. The bullet technology has come a long way. And if I dive deep into that, that's going to pull us off track for this episode. But just know that bullets are a lot better now than they were in 1906. The cartridges are basically the same. Now we have a new generation of rifle cartridges. And just like Ford was not the first person to come out with a horseless carriage, there were steam-powered even horseless carriages before that. But the first mass-produced, an average person could go out and buy, just simply use. They didn't have to build it themselves or have a machine shop or be independently wealthy to have these things. First common automobile was Ford. There was automobiles before that. The first common of this next-gen cartridge, let's call it Gen 4, the 6.5 Creedmoor. There's a lot of Wildcats before this, the 6.5 284, I believe the 6 Tub. There's a lot of Wildcats before this, but the first one that you could generally go buy a rifle and ammo for off the shelf, the next generation. And you got to realize the 6.5 Creedmoor, I think, was the first commonly, easily available to a common person. You can go in and buy the ammo and the guns at Walmart now. The first commonly available one of this. And what sparked this next generation of cartridges wasn't really anything to do with cartridge or bullet or powder technology. In my opinion, it was computers. Computers became affordable to the common person. And a little bit preceding this, laser rangefinders became a thing a common person could own. So you see, before this, if you wanted to hunt what we call long range, 300 yards, 400 yards, you wanted a flat shooting cartridge. That's something like a 25-06, because it's a really, really hard skill to master. Judge distance that well, especially outside in terrain. Is that deer 350 yards or 385 yards? That makes a big difference. Very few people can judge that accurately all the time and ethically to take those shots. That's why traditionally, and I submit even today, most deer in this country are taken inside 200 yards, no matter what marketing and TV shows would have you believe. And if you're shooting inside 200-300 yards, you want max point blank range. You want to be able to put your crosshairs on the vitals of that animal, or your sights on the vitals of that animal, and pull the trigger, and it might hit an inch high or an inch low, but basically you're going to hit where you're aiming as far as it is important on the deer's vitals. If you get a flatter shooting cartridge, 25-06, 257 Weatherby, 264 Win Mag, you can extend that out a little bit. So that's what you wanted then. When these computers became available and easy, and laser rangefinders became, let's say, affordable. I don't know when the first one came out. The military may have had them for a long time, but where you could just go and buy them, the common man, again, could go get one. That really made a big difference, because now I didn't have to guess. Now I knew if I could laser range find that buck that he was at 362 yards. I didn't need a flat shooting cartridge. I needed an efficient high BC, coming back to that ballistic coefficient thing again. It would cut the wind better because it flies through the air more efficiently. We talked about that. So it's more predictable. It's not flatter shooting. Look at the 6.5 Creedmoor, which came out in 2007, versus the much older 264 Win Mag. It's not anywhere near as flat shooting. It's not. Flat shooting is not what they were going for in that cartridge. They wanted efficiency, they wanted predictability, they wanted high BCs. In order to get that, what they basically did was made the case a little bit smaller. You look at a 6.5 Creedmoor, basically is the same overall length as a 308. They didn't just use a 308 case and neck it down, that would be the 260 Remington, but they took a smaller case, I believe the 30 Thompson Center, which is a little bit shorter. They could put a longer, heavier bullet in it, because longer, heavier bullets slice through the air more efficiently, giving a higher BC, more predictable. With this laser rangefinder, I knew the buck was at, 362 yards. Doesn't matter if the bullet drops 10 inches or 20 inches. As you know that, and you have the ability to, let's say, have ballistic reticles with different holds on them or dial it in on your scope, the amount that it drops doesn't really matter. It matters that you can have a really efficient bullet. What matters more, I should say, if you have all this technology and computers and, you know, ballistic turrets on your scope and all this other stuff, and I should say this was originally developed, the 6.5 Creedmoor, for competition shooting more than hunting, but you get the idea. You need a super fast, super powerful trajectory cartridge. You need a good, predictable cartridge with a high BC, and I think 6.5 Creedmoor was the first common one to do that. Now, this is the Gen 4. We have a lot of these now with that long, sleek bullet, perhaps even less powder capacity than earlier hunting cartridges, less powder capacity and less velocity. Look at the 6.5 Creedmoor, basically the same overall length and everything as a 260 Remington, which came out far earlier. It's got generally a lot less velocity. I shouldn't say a lot less. It has less velocity, but heavier, longer, sleeker bullets. That's what I'm talking about, going from the Gen 3. That's a good example. The 260 Remington, which is basically a 308 neck down to 6.5, is a Gen 3. The 6.5 Creedmoor is a Gen 4. Also, the 6mm Creedmoor, Gen 4. All the PRC cartridges coming out, precision rifle cartridges. A 6.5 PRC, the 7 PRC, which is a new hotness right now, the 300 PRC. These are these Gen 4 cartridges for this long-range, high BC, heavy for caliber bullets. So I'm going to call that the gens of the cartridges. If you listen through all that, I really want to thank you. If you don't care about the nerdy stuff like that, hopefully this is where we get into the practical application side of things. You always want the newer technology. Is the newer and the 4th gen always better than the Gen 3 or the Gen 2 or the Gen 1 even? I would submit no. I'm very blessed to be able to help out one of the patrons, and he came to me talking about wanting to plan out a Western hunt. Talked to him about what are his goals. Number one goal in a hunt, in a podcast, and working out, and practicing shooting, and whatever it is, should be growing closer to God. But your secondary goals to that, does he want to go have a good, comfortable, relaxing trip with his wife and maybe shoot an animal? Does he want to hunt hard and get a big racked elk, no matter what it takes? Hunting's never a guarantee, right? But you get the idea. Those are two very different hunts. You want to be able to hunt elk in a t-shirt, or do you want to be able to adventure and cross-country ski up the side of a mountain and hunt elk? Because you can hunt elk both those ways. Far different climates. You can hunt elk in Arizona, and you can hunt elk in Montana. Far different climates. You should ask yourself the same thing about what kind of cartridge do you want? What kind of hunting are you going to do? Look at the Gen 1 cartridge, the 4570. It's still around. It still takes animals from meat on the cloven hoof to meat on the table for my family or your family. It still does that. We talked about the newer bullets are far higher velocity if you're going from that to the newer gens. Does that matter to you? Are you hunting, let's say you're hunting moose in Maine from a canoe in these little tiny channels and marshes and swamps. If you see a moose, it's likely going to be 50 yards and in. Big, heavy, slow bullet out of a 4570 is going to do just fine. A quick handling, lever action carbine like that. These tactical lever actions and things are a thing now. They're kind of the new hotness. I'm not going to get into how practical or impractical those are. If you're hunting moose in a canoe in Maine, the 4570 and a lever action might be a good choice. You don't need a newer gen. In fact, a newer gen might not be as good. You might make the argument that an old Gen 1 is better for that than the brand new hotness of the 7mm PRC. In fact, I would take it over that. Now let's talk about the Gen 2. You want maybe a little bit more range, a little bit more velocity. You're going to be hunting whitetail in the New England area, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, I'm sure they still allow some form of hunting there. Places like that, where you don't own farm fields, you're not part of the landed gentry, you don't have vast swaths of really long shots, you're hunting in public land and woods. Your shots are going to be close. You might get a shot at 150. The 30-30 on whitetail deer and even black bear will do everything you need it to do. The Winchester 94 is a light, handy little carbine. That might be the best choice. A newer generation of bullet technology may not do you any good and may do you some harm in that. A 30-30 with 150 to 170 grain bullet has been putting white-tailed deer and elk and all manner of beasts in freezers for a long time. Before there were freezers, it's been putting beasts down. So think about that. If that's what you want to hunt with iron sights, with a light handy carbine, walking through the woods, that Gen 2 might be right on the money for you. Now let's talk about where I think the vast majority of us lie, and that's the Gen 3 cartridges. If you like to spot and stalk hunt, if you like to still hunt, or if you hunt out of a stand, not my favorite way, but hey, a lot of people do it, probably a lot more than spot and stalk hunt, and your longest shot's going to be inside of 300 yards. Those newer, more modern high BC bullets really aren't any better for you. In fact, they might be worse, because remember that flat trajectory inside of 300 yards, probably better off the 264 Win Mag than a 6.5 Creedmoor. 6.5 Creedmoor is a great cartridge. I have one. I don't even use it for the Gen 4 reasons. I just have it because I really wanted that rifle. Look for one in a Gen 3 cartridge, and I could only find it in 6.5 Creedmoor. It's still a good cartridge, but I'm really not gaining in the way of those super long range high BC bullets. So if you're hunting inside 300 yards from a stand, from a spot and stalk standpoint, or if you're just hunting somewhere where beyond 300 yards is not even really possible, those Gen 3 cartridges, the good old 30-06, the 308, one of my favorites, the 243. Those are fantastic, and I would argue still the best choice for most people. Now, if you want to, this is primarily a western thing, west of the Mississippi, you want a heavier rifle with a heavier scope, or more drawn to what call the science and the mathematics of shooting. I'm much more like the art and the skill of shooting, but some people are drawn to the mathematics and things like that of shooting, and that's fine. That's just because there are different personalities in me, that's fine. If you are drawn to that, like how many clicks do I need at this distance and that distance, that really gets you going. You want a fairly heavy rifle with a big scope and a laser rangefinder and good binoculars, and you're going to hunt from a quad or a side-by-side to haul that gear around. You're going to try and shave some weight off here or there, or do a really long backpack hunt out west. You want to be able to shoot an animal at 1,000 yards, at 600 yards, at 700 yards. These Gen 4 cartridges make a big difference for that group of hunters. But if that group of hunters is not you, don't think that you are missing out by not having the brand new cartridge. This podcast is not like a lot of hunting shows, a lot of other things where it's like basically a commercial where I'm telling you should buy the next hot thing. Hope you appreciate that. If you do, I hope you'll consider supporting. Anyway, if that's not you, if that small subsection of the hunting population is not you, then it doesn't matter. You don't need a 7, PRC. It's a good cartridge. It looks really good. It looks like a good cartridge. If you hunt like I do, you like to spot and stalk and still hunt, does that cartridge do anything for you that a 7mm Rem Mag doesn't do? No, not really. In fact, I'd probably get the 7 Rem Mag because the ammunition's cheaper and easier to get. So realize, what are your goals? If you just want the next hottest cartridge because you just like the next latest and greatest thing, that's fine. But if your goal is to meet or to be a successful hunter, don't think that you're somehow behind or less of a hunter because you don't have PRC behind your cartridge. 30-06 has been putting animals in the dirt for a long time. It will continue to do so. The kind of hunting I do in 308 or 30-06 or 300 PRC, I would take the 308 or the 30-06 depending on what size game I was hunting and how heavy a bullet I wanted. But I don't want anything to do with that 300 PRC. I like to spot and stalk and still hunt. My go-to general guide rifle is the rifle itself under 5 pounds. I don't want to shoot a 300 PRC in a rifle like that. I don't want to lug around a big heavy rifle with a big heavy scope on it to take advantage of that, because I like to cover a lot of ground and hunt in really hard, nasty environments. I like to go where there aren't roads. I like to go where there aren't quads. Shooting animals at a really long distance, that's not the kind of thrill that I look for. I would rather stalk up on and shoot a nice mule deer at 20 yards because I got that close to him without him knowing I was there, and to shoot one at 600 or 700 yards. Not because I couldn't. I don't say this to brag, but I cut my teeth. I won my first gold medal in precision rifle shooting before I graduated high school. It was a long time ago. I could if I wanted to. I enjoy the art and the fieldcraft of stalking and still hunting and finding the animal and getting close to it. Think of all the deer and elk and exotic species I've ever hunted. Taken one shot at an elk, any animal, but it was an elk over 300 yards. And I wish that I had just not, because I've killed plenty of animals. Just the terrain and the time I had to hunt, and they were walking away from me. Try keeping up with a moving elk herd on foot. It's difficult. Anyway, I took that shot. That's the only one. I did kill that elk, but I would much rather get closer if I can. That's just me. But look at that for yourself. Do you want to hunt whitetail and black bear on public land east of the Mississippi? Or maybe not, maybe that's what you have available. And a lever action in 30-30 or 35 Remington is great. Don't think that you need a newer generation cartridge. If you want to be able to hunt pretty much anything in North America, and you don't want to have 20 different rifles for each different species and subspecies and terrain, and you like to spot and stalk and still hunt, don't want to carry a computer with you, then a good bolt action 308 30-06 7mm Rem mag will do just fine. It's a good, solid choice. Anyway, I think that's a good place to start wrapping up the generations of cartridges, why things are the way they are, why we're where we're at today, and what you might want to choose, whether or not it's the next latest and greatest thing. I hope this has been a helpful podcast. Not the most exciting, maybe it won't get the most views like the next cool hot gear list that I put out or something, but I hope it's good, practical advice. Whether you're talking about hunting or just shooting in general, hopefully it helps and puts out good information. With that, I'm going to do the tactical verse of the day because I don't want you to miss it. Then I'm going to do an announcement for a giveaway, put in the bio, and then the tactical tip of the day. The tactical verse of the day. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. You shall follow what is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Let us strive, men, to be fair and just in our dealings. Judge righteously based on facts, not favorites, not but by what we're getting, not by a bribe. With that, if you want to tune out and not listen to the bio because you've heard it before, that's fine. I am going to do an announcement, a new Patreon giveaway. For any new patrons for the month of January, I will be giving away a mini ultralight bug out bag. You're probably familiar with the concept if you listen to Alpha Male Podcast, or if you've listened a while, you know I'm a big fan of that. I have a full-size bug out bag. I also have a small shoulder bag for a full-size fighting handgun and a tourniquet and a decent knife that if I'm, let's say, jumping in somebody else's car and going on a short trip, I can just grab it. The idea is for it to be within like sprinting distance. Not actually my EDC. I have an EDC, handgun, knife, tourniquet, things like that. This is like that next step without going to the big bug out bag. Anyway, I have one to give away, a really nice Smith & Wesson sling bag and a really nice knife. This knife I picked out because I think it's a really good balance of a fixed blade knife. You can put it in the bag if you want. You can carry it as, your baby bug out bag gun. You also, if you've listened, know that I'm a big fan of everyday carrying a fixed blade knife. This is a good all-around size knife. If you wanted to get into that and it's legal where you are, it's called the SOG Bushcraft fixed blade knife. But I think, to me, it looks tactical. It's a good mix of that. I mean, I chose it for a reason. Out of all the knives out there, I decided to get this one. It's not crazy heavy. It's robust enough that I would not have a problem using it in the field, but not have a problem carrying it as a tactical knife on tactical kit. I have a problem boning out an elk with it. It's a good all-around knife. Again, the SOG Bushcraft. I'm going to give that away for any new patron that signs up in January. I have to thank one of the existing patrons for that. They came up with the idea in November. We did a knife giveaway, and I thought that was a good idea. I should do that. And my thanks to all the patrons, but that one especially for what he did. He bought a knife out of his own money and raffled it off to new patrons. I am going to do the same thing for new patrons this month, a knife and a tactical sling bag. We'll put pictures up on Patreon. You can check those out. Also may incorporate it as the thumbnail. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that. Tie it into today's episode. A really cool giveaway. I hope it gets you excited. Hopefully you think about becoming a patron. Also some content if you want to go to Patreon and check that out. Most of it is for just the patrons. But there is some content there that I have open to the public. You can check it out. If you've never been a patron of anybody or know what it's about, you can go check it out. There should be a link in the show notes. I will make photos of this giveaway available to the public on Patreon. We'll also do a special giveaway because I don't think it's fair to just give away stuff all the time to new patrons. I'm going to do a special giveaway for all the existing patrons. I'm going to keep that a secret, I think, and only the patrons will know about it. I'll put it out as a Patreon only, visible to new patrons post about what they can win. I might raffle a few different things off for them. Anyway, I am humbled and thankful for the time that you've given me today, and I am very humbled and thankful to all the patrons. Hopefully you'll consider becoming a new one. I will plug in the bio and then the tactical tip at the end. So, who am I? Who is this person talking to you from across the internet? Why should you listen? First and foremost, I am a Christian, a servant of God, and a follower of Jesus Christ. God has blessed me to do many things in my life, for I could do nothing apart from Him. U.S. Marine Corps combat veteran, did a couple of tours in Iraq. As an assaultman after my combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor for the Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. Also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Also did several years in law enforcement, LAPD. I worked regular assignments and more specialized assignments. Been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency. That's all I'll say about that. Been blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion and West Coast regional rifle champion. Won more shooting competitions with the talent that God's given me than I can actually remember. Was blessed to be the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. Our primary job, the reason we primarily existed, was to stop active shooters. I got the opportunity to head up and be the commander of that team. I grew up around guns, hunting and shooting and competing at a very early age. Been blessed to hunt all over this beautiful country, from whitetail on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast, and bear and elk and all manner of things. I've even been a professional big game hunter and guide. But again, most importantly, I'm a Christian. And I am your host, Michael Melito. Welcome to the podcast. The tactical tip of the day: fast draws. You must temper this with reality. Now you're going to get into a gunfight like an old spaghetti western where you both walk out into the street at high noon and stand there and trade shot for shot. As good a movie as The Quick and the Dead is, I don't think that's really realistic. It certainly does not represent any, how can we politically correctly state this? It doesn't represent any tactical adversarial situation I've ever been in, right? So a fast draw, it's important. But you know what can make you have a much faster draw? Already having your hand on the gun. Some carry methods are a lot more conducive to this. It's wintertime. You may consider carrying, let's say, in a coat pocket. You could not only have your hand on the gun making your draw faster, if somebody gets really close to you, you could literally just shoot them through the pocket of your coat. They'll never even know. If they pull out a knife or something, you don't even ever have to present that gun. You can already have your hand on the gun when they start walking up. You can just shoot out of your coat. That's a thing. You can also do a similar thing with a pants pocket. If you're on the ground and they're on top of you, you can orient your leg to the center of their chest and do a similar thing. If you've practiced it, if you know what you're doing. Some guns work better for this than others. Small, handy, lightweight revolvers have an advantage here. But even so, even if you carry a regular full-size gun on your hip, you can get behind cover and have your hand on your gun, because a lot of times you have to get your gun out really, really fast, from zero to hero real quick, but not all the time. Sometimes you might be in that 7-Eleven or something if you go to 7-Elevens. And some people walk in that you don't think, just put it this way, you get a bad feeling that something might go down. You might be able to step behind some rows of things, put your hand on your gun where they can't see you, then your hand's already on your gun. And one of the things that can really mess up a draw is not getting a proper firing grip on the gun right away. But you can do that and already have a proper firing grip on the gun. And if you have to draw it, then you're already a lot of the way there. And if you don't, then you don't. And it's not a thing, right? So keep that in mind. I practice a draw a lot. I am blessed by God to have a very, very fast draw. I have won more shooting competitions and steel challenge, which is kind of like drag racing with a pistol, than I can remember. But still, talking about a real life scenario, if I can already have my hand on my gun, it makes more sense to already have my hand on my gun. So keep that in mind. A tactical tip that may just save your life one day. Hopefully you never need it. I am humbled that you listen. Thanks, and have a blessed day.